In 1982, a young couple vanished from a roadside motel. No witnesses, no bodies, just a burned-out car and decades of silence. But when a smoldering landfill uncovers a perfectly preserved cassette tape sealed beneath 40 years of garbage, the recording inside will unravel a buried truth more twisted and more alive than anyone imagined. Hit subscribe for more strange disappearances, haunted cold cases, and reality-bending investigations. Because every case starts with what's missing and ends with what was never supposed to be found. The landfill had been burning for 3 days when they found it. Not the dramatic kind of fire that makes the evening news, just a slow, persistent smolder deep in the compressed layers of decades-old garbage. The kind that eats through plastic and metal with patient hunger, leaving behind pockets of ash and the acrid smell of things that were never meant to burn together. Maria Santos pulled her truck to the edge of the construction site and killed the engine. Through the windshield, she watched the excavation crew standing in a loose circle around their idle machinery. Hard hats tilted back, faces slack with the particular expression of people who'd found something they didn't want to be responsible for. The fire had started small, a spontaneous combustion in a pocket of organic waste that should have been manageable. But when the crew tried to contain it, they'd had to dig deeper than anyone expected. The old municipal dump had layers like sedimentary rock, newspapers from the 80s compressed into papery stone, plastic bags fused into colorful sheets, decades of discarded lives pressed into geological strata. And now, in a crater roughly the size of a swimming pool, something glinted in the morning light. Maria climbed out of the truck, her boots crunching on the frost-hardened dirt. As the county's senior waste management supervisor, she'd seen plenty of odd discoveries over the years: old safes, vintage cars, even a few bones that turned out to be from livestock. But the way the crew was standing, the careful distance they maintained from whatever they'd uncovered, made her stomach tighten. "What we got, Tommy?" she called to the site foreman, a weathered man in his 60s who'd been working landfills since before environmental regulations had teeth. Tommy Brennan pointed into the crater without taking his eyes off her face. "Found it about an hour ago, when we were trying to get to the source of the heat. It was wrapped in plastic, sealed tight. Fire never touched it." Maria approached the edge and looked down. In the center of the blackened pit, surrounded by melted debris and ash, sat a small rectangular object. Even from 15 feet above, she could see it clearly. A cassette tape in a clear plastic case, the kind used for answering machines in the early 80s. The label was handwritten in blue ink, though she couldn't make out the words from this distance. "You touch it?" she asked. "Hell no." Tommy shifted his weight from foot to foot. "But listen, Maria, that's not the weird part." She turned to him, eyebrows raised. "The plastic it was wrapped in, it's not degraded, not even yellowed. Thing looks like it was sealed yesterday. But we pulled it from a section that's been covered since 83, maybe 84. And the way it was positioned." He paused, running a hand through his graying hair. "It wasn't thrown in with the rest of the trash. Someone buried it. Carefully." The construction crew, 5 men who'd worked together for years and had seen their share of the strange and unpleasant, maintained their careful circle. Maria noticed that none of them were looking directly at the tape. There was something about the way it sat in the crater, pristine and intentional, that made it feel less like a discovery and more like a message. "Could be evidence," said one of the younger workers, a man Maria didn't recognize. "From some old case." Tommy shook his head. "County stopped using this site for official disposal in 82. After that, it was just regular municipal waste. Household stuff." Maria pulled out her phone and took several photos from different angles. The morning light caught the plastic case, and she could see that the cassette inside was a standard TDK brand, the kind sold at drugstores and electronics shops. Nothing special about it except for its impossible preservation and the deliberate nature of its burial. "We need to call someone," she said finally. "This isn't normal disposal." "Who you gonna call?" Tommy asked. "Sheriff's department? They're gonna laugh at us for finding old garbage in a dump." But Maria was studying the tape more closely through her phone's camera, zooming in on the handwritten label. The ink was still bright blue, the letters clear and urgent. She could make out what looked like a date, but it was hard to read from this angle. "Get me a ladder," she said. "Maria, just get me a ladder, Tommy." 10 minutes later, she was standing in the crater, the smell of burnt plastic and metal thick in her nostrils. The tape sat on a small island of unburned debris, as if the fire had deliberately avoided it. Up close, the preservation was even more unsettling. The plastic case showed no signs of age, no yellowing or cracking. The tape inside looked factory fresh, but it was the label that made her hands tremble as she lifted it. Written in a woman's careful handwriting, "June and Daniel last call, May 15, 1982. Below that, in different ink as if added later, "Play only if we don't come home." Maria stared at the words, her mind immediately jumping to the stories her mother used to tell about the couple who'd vanished from the Starlight Motel back in '82. Everyone in town knew the story. Young couple, car found burned out near the highway, bodies never recovered. The kind of local mystery that gets told and retold until it becomes more legend than fact. She'd been 8 years old when it happened, but she remembered the search parties, the way adults would stop talking when children came into the room. She remembered her mother saying that some things were better left buried. "Maria," Tommy's voice came from above. "You okay down there?" She looked up at the circle of faces peering down at her, all of them waiting for her to make sense of what they'd found. The tape felt warm in her hands, though that could have been from the residual heat of the fire. "Yeah," she called back, but her voice sounded strange even to herself. "I'm fine." She wasn't fine, because as she held the tape, she could swear she heard something. Not sound exactly, but the suggestion of sound. Like the whisper of a voice just below the threshold of hearing. The fire in the landfill had stopped smoldering. The morning had gone completely still, and Maria Santos stood in a crater full of ash, holding a message from 1982, wondering what June and Daniel had needed to say so badly that they'd buried it for someone to find, wondering if anyone was meant to find it at all. Talia Granger learned about the tape while sitting in her car outside her therapist's office, scrolling through police scanner apps instead of going inside. The notification popped up on her phone. Chester County Sheriff, evidence recovery, possible connection to 1982 cold case. She'd set up alerts for anything involving missing persons from the 80s, part of the obsessive research that had made her podcast, Vanished, one of the most downloaded true crime series in the country, but also part of the obsession that had landed her back in therapy. She called Sheriff's Deputy Ray Kowalski before the notification was 5 minutes old. "This about the tape?" Talia asked, skipping pleasantries. Ray had been her source for 3 years now, ever since she'd helped break open the Melissa Torrance case and made the department look good on national television. "Christ, Talia. Do you have the scanner on constantly?" "Pretty much. What do you have?" Pause. "Cassette tape, buried in the old municipal dump, labeled with names and a date from 1982. Maria Santos found it this morning when a fire opened up a section that's been sealed for 40 years. Talia pulled out her notebook, a leather-bound thing she'd carried since journalism school, edges worn soft from constant handling. Names? June and Daniel. Last names not clear from what I'm hearing. Date says May 15, 1982. The pen stopped moving in Talia's hand. May 15, 1982. She knew that date. She'd known it since she was 8 years old, when she'd found her mother's death certificate tucked between pages of a recipe book, trying to understand why her father never talked about the car accident that killed her mother when Talia was barely 2. "Talia? You there?" "Yeah, I'm here." "The tape. Have you listened to it?" "Not yet. It's being processed. But here's the thing." Ray's voice dropped. "The label says, 'Play only if we don't come home.' And according to the records, a couple named June Wallace and Daniel Mercer disappeared from the Starlight Motel that exact same night. Car found burned. Bodies never recovered." Talia's throat went dry. Her mother's maiden name had been Wallace. Miranda Wallace, before she married David Granger. Before she died in a car accident that Talia had never been able to find details about, no matter how many times she'd called the county clerk's office or searched newspaper archives. "Ray, I need to hear that tape. It's evidence, Talia, and it's not your case. Make it my case." Her voice came out harder than she intended. I'll do a full series on it. Give your department the credit. But I need access. She ended the call and sat in her car, hands shaking slightly as she pulled up the photos she'd never shown anyone. Not her father, not her therapist, not even Danny, her research assistant who knew more about her work than anyone. Photos she'd taken with her phone years ago, sneaking into her father's closet while he was at work. The first photo showed a shoebox full of documents. Birth certificates, marriage licenses, social security cards, all bearing the names David and Miranda Granger, all dated after 1982. But underneath those, barely visible, were older documents with different names entirely. The second photo was closer, focused on a single document. A marriage certificate from 1981. David Mercer and Miranda Wallace. Talia had never asked her father about it. The one time she tried, when she was 16 and full of teenage righteousness about family secrets, he'd gone so pale she thought he might collapse. He'd simply said, "Some things are better left buried, sweetheart," and left the room. She'd never brought it up again. But now, sitting outside Dr. Hendrick's office with a police report about a cassette tape from May 15, 1982, she understood that her entire life might have been built on a foundation she'd never questioned. Her phone buzzed with a text from her father. "Dinner Sunday? Been too long since we talked." She stared at the message for a long time before typing back. "Rain check. Working on something big." Then she opened her voice memo app and began recording, the way she always did when a case got under her skin. "This is Talia Granger, and I think I just found a story that's going to ruin my life. 3 hours ago, a cassette tape was discovered in a landfill in Chester County. The tape is labeled with the names June and Daniel, dated May 15, 1982. That's the same night a couple named June Wallace and Daniel Mercer disappeared from a local motel." She paused, watching a couple walk hand in hand toward the medical building, their faces relaxed and trusting. What would it feel like to walk through the world believing your life was exactly what it appeared to be? "Here's what I haven't told anyone yet. My mother's maiden name was Wallace. My father's name, before he became David Granger, was apparently David Mercer. And according to every document I can find, my parents didn't exist before 1982. A police cruiser drove past, and Talia instinctively ducked lower in her seat, though Ray couldn't possibly know where she was. "I've built a career on finding missing people, on giving voices to the disappeared. But what if the people I've been looking for my whole life have been sitting across from me at the dinner table? What if my father isn't the man who lost his wife in a car accident? What if he's the man who made her disappear?" She stopped recording and sat in the silence of her car, the weight of the question settling over her like snow. Outside, ordinary people went about their ordinary lives, secure in the knowledge that they knew who they were and where they came from. Talia Granger was no longer one of those people. She started the car and drove toward Chester County, toward a landfill where someone had buried a message 40 years ago, never imagining that the person who found it might recognize the voice of the woman calling for help. Her phone rang as she merged onto the highway. Her father's name appeared on the screen. She let it go to voicemail. The Starlight Motel looked like it was dying by degrees. Talia stood in the parking lot, gravel crunching under her boots, as she surveyed the collection of faded turquoise doors and rust-stained concrete. Half the neon sign was dark, leaving only Star flickering weakly against the overcast sky. Room 7, where June Wallace and Daniel Mercer had spent their last known night, was marked with a number that hung slightly crooked, as if the building itself was slowly forgetting how to hold things together. She'd driven straight here from the landfill, Ray Kowalski's reluctant permission to observe the scene still ringing in her ears. The tape was being processed at the state lab, but wouldn't be ready for 24 hours. 24 hours to sit with the possibility that her entire life was a lie. "You the podcast lady?" Talia turned to find a woman in her 70s approaching from the motel office, moving with the careful gait of someone whose joints had logged too many decades. She wore a cardigan despite the mild weather and carried herself with the particular authority of someone who'd been watching the same piece of ground for longer than most people had been alive. "I'm Talia Granger. You must be Betty Kowalski. Ray's my nephew." The woman extended a hand marked with age spots and calluses. He called, said you might be coming around asking about the couple from 82. You remember them? Betty's laugh was dry as the autumn air. Honey, when you've been running this place for 43 years, you remember everyone who doesn't pay their bill. She led Talia toward room 7, fishing a master key from her pocket. They checked in around 6 May 15th. Young couple, maybe mid-20s. She was nervous, kept looking over her shoulder. He seemed, I don't know, distracted, like his mind was somewhere else entirely. The door opened with a squeal of hinges that suggested it hadn't been properly maintained in decades. Inside, the room was a time capsule of early 80s motel decor. Wood-paneled walls, orange shag carpet, a television that looked like it weighed as much as a refrigerator. But what struck Talia immediately was how clean it was. Not just clean, preserved. As if Betty had been waiting 40 years for someone to come back. You've kept it exactly the same, Talia observed. Betty nodded, settling onto the edge of the bed. Couldn't bring myself to change it. They left things behind. The police report said no personal effects were recovered. Police report was wrong. Betty opened the drawer of the bedside table and withdrew a small wooden box. I found these after the investigators finished. Figured someone would come back for them eventually. Inside the box were 3 items. A silver bracelet with a tiny heart charm, a folded piece of paper, and a Polaroid photograph. Talia's hands trembled as she lifted the photo. It showed a young woman with dark hair and green eyes, laughing at something beyond the camera's frame. She wore the silver bracelet and a sundress that looked expensive. But it was her face that made Talia's breath catch. The shape of the eyes, the curve of the mouth, the way she tilted her head slightly when she smiled. Talia had seen that exact expression in her bathroom mirror every morning for 38 years. That's June, Betty said quietly. She gave me this photo when they checked in, said if anything happened to them, I should give it to the police. But the police never asked me about personal effects. They took one look at the burned car and decided they were dead. Talia unfolded the piece of paper with unsteady fingers. It was a note, written in the same careful handwriting she'd seen on the cassette label. If something happens to us, don't believe what they tell you. Daniel isn't who I thought he was. I found things in his apartment, other women's jewelry, driver's licenses that don't belong to him. I think I'm next. If you find this, look for the tape. I'm going to try to call my sister before. The note ended mid-sentence. Betty, Talia's voice came out as a whisper. The man she was with. What did he look like? Tall, maybe 6'2". Dark hair, needed a shave. Had a scar through his left eyebrow, like from an old fight. Hands looked soft, like he'd never done manual labor. And his eyes. Betty paused, studying Talia's face. You know, you look an awful lot like her. Around the eyes especially. Talia set the photo down carefully. Her father was 6'2", had dark hair that was now gray, and carried a scar through his left eyebrow from what he'd always told her was a childhood accident. His hands were soft because he'd worked in accounting his entire life. Or at least, that's what she'd always believed. Betty, I need to ask you something, and I need you to tell me the truth. When Daniel spoke, did he have any kind of accent? Any distinctive way of talking? The older woman closed her eyes, reaching back across 4 decades. Funny you should ask. Most people around here, we talk pretty flat. Midwest plain. But Daniel, he had this slight southern drawl. Not heavy, but noticeable. Made me think he wasn't from around here originally. Talia's father had a slight southern accent. He'd always said it was from childhood summers spent with grandparents in Tennessee. One more thing, Betty continued. After they disappeared, after the police stopped looking, I had this feeling someone was watching the motel. For weeks, maybe months. A car would park across the street, different cars but always the same feeling. Like someone was making sure nobody came back looking for answers. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the motel's windows. Talia stood and walked to the window that faced the parking lot, trying to imagine June Wallace standing in the same spot 40 years ago, afraid and alone. not knowing that her attempt to leave evidence would lie buried for decades. "Betty," she said without turning around, "if I told you that I think Daniel Mercer might have survived that night, and that he might have been living under a different name all these years, what would you say?" The silence stretched long enough that Talia turned back. Betty was studying her with sharp eyes that missed nothing. "I'd say that would explain why someone's been paying the property taxes on this motel for 40 years, Betty said finally. "Anonymous payments, always in cash, always exactly on time. I'd say it would explain why room 7 never gets rented out, even when we're full. And I'd say," she paused, looking directly at Talia, "I'd say it would explain why you look so much like a dead woman." Talia's phone buzzed with a text from Ray. "Tape is ready. Lab says the audio is crystal clear. How soon can you get here?" She looked back at the photograph of June Wallace, at the unfinished note, at the bracelet that might have been torn from a woman's wrist in a moment of desperate struggle. Then she looked at Betty Kowalski, who had been keeping secrets for 40 years, waiting for someone to ask the right questions. "Betty, I think I'm June's daughter," Talia said. "And I think my father killed her." The cassette player sat on the metal table like an accusation. Talia stared at it through the one-way glass of the sheriff's department's interview room. Her hands clenched so tightly, her knuckles had gone white. Ray Kowalski stood beside her, coffee growing cold in his hand, waiting for her to give the signal. The lab technician had already explained the technical details: remarkably clear audio, minimal degradation, definitely recorded in 1982 based on the magnetic signature analysis. What he hadn't said, but what his expression suggested, was that listening to it was going to hurt. "You don't have to do this today," Ray said quietly. "We could wait." "No." Talia's voice was steady, though her hands weren't. "I need to hear it." Ray nodded to the technician, who pressed play. Static filled the room, then the hollow sound of a phone connection. When the voice came, Talia's world tilted sideways. "Sarah? Oh God, Sarah, please pick up. Please be there." It was her mother's voice. Not similar to it, not reminiscent of it. It was Miranda Wallace's voice, frightened and desperate and alive in a way Talia had never heard it. The few home videos her father had shown her featured a quiet woman who smiled but rarely laughed, who spoke softly and seemed always slightly removed from the moment. This voice was raw with terror. "Sarah, I think I made a terrible mistake. Daniel isn't who I thought he was. I found things, oh God. I found pictures of other women. And jewelry that isn't mine. There's a driver's license in his apartment with his photo but a different name entirely. David something. I think." A door slammed in the background. "He's back. Sarah, if something happens to me, if I don't call you tomorrow, call the police. Tell them to look for Daniel Mercer, but his real name might be David. Tell them about the women in the photos. Tell them I." The phone line went dead. Talia was on her feet before she realized she'd moved. One hand pressed to her mouth, the other reaching toward the cassette player, as if she could somehow pull her mother through it, pull her back from 40 years of silence. "Talia, play it again. Maybe we should. Play it again." The words came out as a shout, echoing off the cinder block walls. Ray nodded to the technician, who rewound the tape. This time Talia listened differently. Not to the terror in her mother's voice, but to the details. The background sounds, traffic outside, what sounded like a television in another room. The way her mother said, "David something," as if she'd seen the name but couldn't quite remember it. The careful pronunciation of Daniel Mercer, like she was making sure someone would understand every syllable. When it ended the second time, Talia turned to Ray. "Who's Sarah? We're looking into it." "Sarah Wallace, presumably. But records from that long ago." He shrugged. "We'll find her." But Talia was already pulling out her phone, scrolling through contacts until she found the number she'd called exactly once, 3 years ago, during her research into her mother's past. "Aunt Sarah?" The woman who answered sounded older than Talia remembered, her voice scratchy with decades of cigarettes. "This is Talia Granger, Miranda's daughter." A long pause. "Talia? Jesus, honey, I haven't heard from you since. What's going on? Is your father okay?" "Sarah, I need to ask you about the night my mother died. May 15th, 1982. The silence that followed was so complete Talia thought the call had dropped. Sarah, your mother didn't die in a car accident, did she? Sarah's voice was barely a whisper. You knew. I got a call. Miranda was scared. Said she'd discovered something about the man she was seeing. Said his name wasn't really Daniel, that she'd found evidence he'd hurt other women. She was calling from some motel. Said she was going to confront him. Talia closed her eyes. What did you tell her? I told her to run. I told her to pack her things and come to me in Denver, that we'd figure it out together. But she said she couldn't just disappear, that she had to know the truth. She said. Sarah's voice cracked. She said if anything happened to her, I should tell the police everything. But when I called the next day, the police said they'd been in a car accident. Both of them. Bodies burned beyond recognition. You never told them about the phone call? I tried, but the detective I spoke to said the case was closed, that it was clearly an accident. He said bringing up unsubstantiated allegations about the deceased would only cause more pain for the families involved. A bitter laugh. Families. As if Daniel Mercer had any family who cared. Talia felt the pieces clicking into place with horrible clarity. Sarah, what happened to me? After the accident. Your father came to get you. Said you were his daughter, that he and Miranda had been married, that he was your legal guardian. He had all the paperwork, marriage certificate, birth certificate with his name as the father. I didn't know what else to do. You were barely 2 years old, and you looked so much like Miranda. But you had doubts. Honey, I'd known your mother her whole life. She'd never mentioned being married to anyone, and she sure as hell never mentioned having a baby. The last time I saw her before that phone call was Christmas 1981, and she was single. But this man had legal documents, and the police said he was your father, and I... Sarah's voice broke completely. I convinced myself I must have been wrong, that Miranda had kept secrets from me. Talia stared at her reflection in the one-way glass, seeing her mother's eyes staring back. What if he wasn't my father? What if he just took me? Then that would mean... Sarah stopped, the implications too terrible to voice. It would mean he killed her and stole her daughter, Talia finished. It would mean I've been living with my mother's murderer for 36 years. Through the glass, she watched Ray Kowalski's face pale as he listened to her side of the conversation. The technician had stopped pretending not to eavesdrop and was staring openly. Talia, Sarah said slowly, there's something else. Something I never told anyone. What? The night before Miranda called me, I got a different call. A man, asking if I knew where she was. Said he was her boyfriend, that they'd had a fight and he wanted to apologize. But when I asked him to leave a message, he hung up. You think it was Daniel? I think it was someone who already knew she was planning to leave him. Someone who was hunting her. Talia ended the call and turned back to the cassette player. Her mother's voice was still there, trapped in magnetic tape, calling out across 4 decades for help that would never come. Ray, she said quietly, I need you to run DNA tests. Compare my sample to anything you might have from the original crime scene. Talia, if David Granger isn't your biological father, then everything I thought I knew about my life is a lie. She looked at him directly. And the man who raised me is a killer. The DNA results came back on a Thursday morning while Talia sat in her car outside her childhood home, gathering courage she wasn't sure she possessed. Ray's voice was careful when he called. Talia, you need to come in. We found something. Just tell me over the phone. Not this. Not over the phone. She drove to the sheriff's department with her hands shaking on the steering wheel, past the elementary school where David Granger had attended every parent-teacher conference, past the diner where he'd taken her for birthday breakfasts, past 40 years of ordinary father-daughter memories that might have been something else entirely. Ray was waiting with a file folder and an expression she'd never seen on his face before. The DNA results, he said without preamble, confirm that David Granger is not your biological father. Talia had expected this, had prepared herself for it, but hearing it spoken aloud still felt like stepping off a cliff. What else? We compared your sample to DNA recovered from June Wallace's belongings, hair from the bracelet Betty Kowalski kept. You're definitely her daughter. Ray opened the folder. But that's not the complicated part. He slid a photograph across the table. It showed a man in his early 30s with dark hair and the scar through his left eyebrow that Talia knew as well as her own reflection. But the name printed below wasn't David Granger or even Daniel Mercer. Michael David Torres, Ray said. Born in El Paso, Texas, 1951. Suspected in the disappearances of at least 4 women between 1978 and 1982. But never charged due to lack of evidence. He was very good at making women fall in love with him, very good at making them trust him completely before they vanished. Talia stared at the photograph. This is my father? This is the man who took you, yes. But here's where it gets strange. Ray pulled out another document. Michael Torres was found dead in a car accident outside Tucson, Arizona, on May 20th, 1982. 5 days after your mother's phone call. The room went silent except for the hum of fluorescent lights overhead. That's impossible, Talia said finally. That's what we thought. So we dug deeper. Ray spread out more papers. Turns out Michael Torres had a younger brother. David Michael Torres, born 1954. No criminal record, worked as an accountant, quiet life. And according to hospital records, David Torres died of pneumonia in San Antonio on May 18, 1982. Talia felt the world tilt again. 2 brothers. Both dead within days of each other? Both dead within days of your mother's disappearance. Both dead just before David Granger appeared in the public record for the first time. Ray leaned forward. Talia, we think the man who raised you stole not just your mother's life and yours, but his dead brother's identity as well. She tried to process this information, but it felt like trying to hold water in her hands. So who is he? Really? We don't know. But yesterday we got a break. Ray pulled out a final photograph, this one more recent. It showed the same man, older now, gray-haired, standing next to a woman with blonde hair and a nervous smile. This was taken 3 weeks ago at a restaurant in Flagstaff, Arizona. The woman with him filed a missing person report 2 days ago. Talia stared at the photo. The man was definitely David Granger or whoever he really was. But he looked different somehow, more relaxed, younger. The way he was touching the blonde woman's arm was possessive, familiar. Her name is Linda Kozlov, Ray continued. Divorced, works as a dental hygienist. She told police that her boyfriend David, she knew him as David Martinez, had gone out for cigarettes and never came back. She said he'd been acting strange for the past few days, jumpy and paranoid, like he was expecting something bad to happen. He's running, Talia whispered. He knows I found the tape. How could he know that? But even as Ray asked the question, Talia was pulling out her phone, scrolling through her recent calls. There it was 3 days ago when she'd been sitting outside her therapist's office, learning about the tape for the first time. Her father had called. She'd let it go to voicemail. She played the voicemail on speaker. Hi, sweetheart. Just wanted to check in. Been thinking about you a lot lately. Hope you're doing well with your work. Give me a call when you get a chance. There was something in his voice, a forced casualness that she'd heard before, but only now recognized as the tone he used when he was lying. He's been monitoring police scanners, she said with sudden certainty. All those years, he's been listening, waiting for someone to discover what he did. When that tape was found, when the connection to the 1982 case went out over the radio, she looked up at Ray. He knew it was over. Ray was already reaching for his radio. All units, we need to put out a bolo for David Granger, also known as David Martinez. Consider him armed and extremely dangerous. But Talia was thinking about something else. The woman in the photograph, Linda Kozlov, who had trusted a man she thought she knew, just like her mother had trusted Daniel Mercer 40 years ago. Ray. When did Linda report him missing? Tuesday morning. The tape was found Monday. He disappeared Tuesday. Talia felt sick. What if he didn't just run? What if he had to clean up loose ends first? The color drained from Ray's face as he understood what she was suggesting. He grabbed his radio again. Dispatch. I need you to contact Flagstaff PD immediately. We need a welfare check on Linda Kozlov, and we need it now. They waited in terrible silence for what felt like hours but was probably only minutes. When the radio crackled back to life, the news was what Talia had feared but hoped she was wrong about. Sheriff's Department, this is Flagstaff. We've got a body at the Kozlov residence. Female, appears to have been dead for approximately 48 hours. Scene suggests foul play. Talia stood up so fast her chair fell backward. He killed her, just like he killed my mother, just like he's probably killed others. Talia, no, don't you see? He's not running away from the past. He's tying up loose ends. She grabbed her keys. Anyone who might connect him to who he really is, anyone who might have evidence. Where are you going? Betty Kowalski. She's had evidence about my mother for 40 years. If he's been monitoring the investigation, he knows she talked to me. Talia was already heading for the door. He's going to kill her next. Ray was right behind her. We'll take my car. Lights and sirens. As they raced toward the Starlight Motel, Talia's phone rang. Unknown number. She answered on speaker. Hello. Hello, sweetheart. Her father's voice? Calm and warm and exactly the same as it had been her entire life. I think it's time we had a talk. Where are you? Talia's voice came out steadier than she felt. Ray's patrol car cutting through afternoon traffic with sirens wailing. Does it matter? David's tone was conversational, almost affectionate. I'm more interested in where you are. Racing toward that old motel, I imagine. Always so predictable, sweetheart. Even as a little girl, you'd get an idea in your head and pursue it relentlessly. Talia felt the blood drain from her face. How are you? Watching? I've been watching you your entire life, Talia. That's what fathers do. Pause. Well, what men who love their daughters do anyway. Ray grabbed the radio. All units, we have an active threat at the Starlight Motel. Suspect is monitoring our communications and may be armed. But David's laugh came through the phone speaker, warm and familiar. Ray Kowalski. Still trying to be the hero, I see. Tell me, Ray, have you figured out yet that you're not chasing one killer? You're chasing a man who's been saving lives for 40 years. Talia stared at the phone. What are you talking about? Your mother, sweetheart. Beautiful, trusting Miranda. Do you know what she was going to do that night? She was going to leave you with me and run away with another man. She was going to abandon her own daughter. His voice took on a hurt quality that made Talia's skin crawl. I couldn't let that happen. You killed her. I saved you from a life of abandonment. From wondering why your mother chose a stranger over her own child. The tenderness in his voice was worse than anger would have been. Everything I did was to protect you. The world outside the patrol car began to feel unreal. Colors too bright, sounds too sharp. Talia found herself remembering dozens of moments from her childhood. Her father reading her bedtime stories, teaching her to ride a bike, attending every school play and science fair. Had those moments been real, or had she been living in the shadow of a lie so complete she'd never seen its edges? The other women, she managed to say. Linda Kozlov. How many others? Only the ones who threatened our family. His voice remained patient, explaining something obvious to a child. Linda was asking too many questions about my past. She found some old photographs, started making phone calls. I had to make a choice between her life and yours. Ray's knuckles were white on the steering wheel. Into his radio. ETA to Starlight Motel, 2 minutes. Suspect is extremely dangerous and may have hostages. No hostages, Ray. David's voice came through clearly. Just a conversation between a father and daughter that's long overdue. They pulled into the motel parking lot, Ray's car sliding to a stop in front of room 7. The door was standing open, and through it Talia could see Betty Kowalski sitting rigidly in the orange chair. Her face pale but her eyes alert and angry rather than afraid. He's been here for an hour, Betty called out as they approached. Keeps talking about family and protection and cleaning up messes. Man's completely lost his mind. But where was David? Talia could see into the room clearly. Betty was alone. Her phone rang again. I'm not in the room, sweetheart. I'm not even at the motel anymore. But I needed you to come here. I needed you to see something. See what? Look under the bed. The far corner, near the window. Ray drew his weapon and entered the room first, checking corners and the bathroom. Clear, he called, but his voice was tense. Talia knelt beside the bed, her hands shaking as she felt around in the darkness underneath. Her fingers closed on something small and rectangular, another cassette tape. This one was labeled in her father's handwriting, "For Talia, the truth about your mother. Found it." David's voice was pleased. "I've been saving that for you for 38 years, waiting for the right moment to share it. I'm not playing this game. It's not a game, sweetheart. It's your inheritance." His voice softened. "Every daughter deserves to know who her mother really was." Betty spoke up from her chair. "Don't listen to him, honey. I've been hearing his version of events for the past hour, and it's nothing but poison wrapped in pretty words." But Talia was already walking toward the ancient cassette player on the motel room's dresser, the tape heavy in her hand. Some part of her, a part that had been David Granger's daughter for 38 years, needed to know what he wanted her to hear. "Don't," Ray said quietly. "Whatever's on that tape, it's manipulation. You know that." But she was already sliding the cassette into the player, already pressing play, already falling into the trap that had been waiting for her since she was 2 years old. Her mother's voice filled the room, but different this time. Younger, happier. "Daniel, I can't keep doing this. The lying, the sneaking around. I have a daughter, and she deserves better than this." A man's voice responded. Younger than David sounded now, but unmistakably him. "We've talked about this, Miranda. You can't have both. You can't have a normal life with a child and still have what we have together." "What do you mean?" "I mean choose. The kid or us. Because I won't share you with anyone else. Not even your own daughter." Talia felt the room tilt around her. On the tape, her mother was crying. "You're asking me to abandon Talia? I'm asking you to choose love over obligation. Choose passion over suburban mediocrity. Choose me." The tape clicked off. "You see." David's voice through the phone was gentle, understanding. "She was going to choose me, sweetheart. She was going to leave you behind for a man she barely knew. But I couldn't let that happen to you." Talia sank into the other chair, her world reshaping itself around this new information. Her mother hadn't been an innocent victim. She'd been a woman torn between passion and duty, ready to abandon her child for love. "So I made the choice for her," David continued. "I made sure you'd never have to wonder why your mother didn't want you. I made sure you'd grow up knowing you were loved. By lying to me for 40 years? By protecting you from a truth that would have destroyed you." His voice was so familiar, so warm. "And look how you turned out. Strong, independent, successful. Look at the life you've built." Ray was watching her with growing alarm. "Talia, whatever you're thinking, stop. He's been manipulating you since you were a child. This is what he does." But Talia found herself remembering her childhood differently now. Not as the loving home she'd always believed it to be, but as an elaborate performance designed to keep her grateful, compliant, unquestioning. How many times had David steered conversations away from her mother? How many times had he looked sad and distant when she asked about the past, making her feel guilty for bringing up painful memories? "Where are you now?" she asked quietly. "Does it matter?" "I won't run, Talia. I could disappear. I've done it before, but I won't leave you again. Not when you finally understand." "Understand what?" "That everything I did was for love. That sometimes protecting someone means making impossible choices." Pause. "That you're more like me than you want to admit." Talia looked around the motel room, at Betty Kowalski watching her with concerned eyes, at Ray holding his radio like a lifeline, at the cassette player that had just shattered everything she thought she knew about her own story. "I'm nothing like you," she said, but her voice lacked conviction. "Aren't you? You've built a career on obsessing over missing women, on inserting yourself into other people's tragedies. You've never maintained a relationship longer than 6 months because you're always looking for someone who doesn't exist. You're searching for me, sweetheart. You've been searching for me your whole life, even when you thought you hated what I represented." The words hit like physical blows because they contained just enough truth to hurt. She had sabotaged relationships. She did obsess over cases involving missing women. She had always felt like she was looking for something she couldn't name. Talia. Ray's voice seemed to come from very far away. Look at me. She turned toward him, but his face looked strange, like she was seeing him through water. He's in your head. This is what abusers do. They reframe reality until you can't tell what's true anymore. But was Ray right, or was David? Had she been living a lie of protection or a lie of control? Were the memories of her loving father real, or were they programming designed to keep her obedient? Her phone buzzed with a text. Come home, sweetheart. It's time to finish our conversation in person. Then another. If you don't come alone, Betty Kowalski and Ray Kowalski will understand exactly how far a father will go to protect his daughter. Talia looked at the phone, then at Ray, then at Betty. The room felt like it was spinning slowly around her, everything familiar becoming foreign. He's not at the house, she said quietly. He's still here, still watching. Ray was already moving toward the window, but Talia was faster. She was out the door and running toward her car before he could stop her, before she could think about what she was doing, driven by a certainty that felt like instinct but might have been 40 years of careful conditioning. Behind her, Ray was shouting into his radio, but his words were lost in the sound of her engine starting and the voice in her head that sounded exactly like David Granger, telling her what a good daughter would do. The house where Talia had grown up looked smaller than she remembered, squatting beneath old oak trees like something trying to hide. She parked in the driveway where she'd learned to ride a bicycle, where David had taught her to change a tire, where 40 years of ordinary father-daughter moments had played out against the backdrop of an extraordinary lie. The front door was unlocked. Inside, the living room was exactly as she remembered. Beige carpet, family photos on the mantel, the recliner where David had read her bedtime stories positioned to face the television. But now the space felt like a stage set, carefully arranged to project normalcy over something rotten at its core. I'm in the kitchen, sweetheart. His voice was the same as always, warm and patient. Talia found him sitting at the kitchen table where they'd shared thousands of meals, hands folded, looking like any other father waiting for his daughter to come home. The only difference was the manila folder positioned precisely in front of him and the way his eyes tracked her movement with predatory attention. You came alone. I'm proud of you. Ray and half the sheriff's department are 5 minutes behind me. No, they're not. David's smile was gentle. Ray is dealing with a gas leak at the motel. Anonymous tip called in just as you left. Amazing how these old buildings develop problems at convenient times. Talia remained standing near the doorway, calculating distances to exits, trying to reconcile the man across from her with the loving father in her memories. But even now, even knowing what she knew, part of her wanted to sit down at the table like she had as a child, to let him explain everything until it made sense again. 40 years, she said instead. 40 years of lying to me. 40 years of loving you. David opened the folder. Do you want to see the truth, Talia? The real truth. Not the sanitized version you've been building in your head. Against her better judgment, she stepped closer. The folder contained photographs, dozens of them, some Polaroids, some professional prints. Her mother at different ages, in different clothes, with different men. Always smiling, always beautiful, always looking at someone just outside the frame with desperate hunger. Your mother was an addict, David said quietly. Not drugs or alcohol attention. Male attention. She moved from man to man like she was collecting experiences, never satisfied, always chasing the next high. Talia picked up one of the photographs. Her mother couldn't have been more than 19, pressed against a man in a leather jacket, her face radiant with infatuation. She abandoned you twice before she met Daniel Mercer, David continued. Left you with babysitters for days while she chased married men, unavailable men, dangerous men. She was building toward abandoning you permanently. I just prevented the inevitable. So you killed her. I saved you from a lifetime of watching her choose other people over you. His voice remained calm, reasonable. I saved you from becoming her. Talia set the photograph down with shaking hands. And the other women? Linda Kozlov and the rest. Threats to our family stability. David's tone was matter-of-fact. Linda was getting suspicious about my past. Before her, there was Catherine in Phoenix. She found some old documents. Before Catherine, there was Maria in Denver. She started asking the wrong questions. He looked up at her with genuine warmth. I've moved us 11 times in 40 years, sweetheart. Every time someone got too close to the truth. Every time our life together was threatened. The kitchen felt smaller now, the walls pressing in. Talia realized that every move in her childhood, the sudden relocations that David had explained as job opportunities or fresh starts, had been flights from murder scenes. How many? Does it matter? I never hurt anyone who wasn't threatening what we had. David leaned forward slightly. And it worked. Look at yourself, Talia. You're successful, independent, strong. You help people find the truth. You're everything your mother never was and never could have been. I'm everything you made me into. Exactly. His smile was proud, paternal. My masterpiece. The word hung in the air between them like a blade. Talia understood, finally, that she hadn't been David's daughter. She'd been his project. 40 years of careful cultivation designed to create someone who would never leave him, never question him, never look too closely at the man behind the loving father facade. The podcast, she said slowly. You encouraged me to start the podcast. You have such a talent for finding missing people. I thought it would be therapeutic. A way to channel your natural curiosity in safe directions. Safe for you. Safe for us. David's voice carried just a hint of steel now. And it was working perfectly until you found that damn tape. Talia's phone buzzed. Text message. Gas leak contained. En route to your location. ETA 3 minutes. Ray. David glanced at her phone and sighed. Ray's very persistent. I like that about him, reminds me of you at that age. Always asking questions, always digging deeper. What are you going to do when he gets here? That depends on you, sweetheart. David's hand moved slightly, revealing the handle of a knife that had been hidden beneath the folder. Are you going to choose your real family? Or are you going to choose strangers who think they understand our relationship? The knife was small, silver, innocuous. The kind used for paring fruit or opening packages. The kind a loving father might use to cut his daughter's sandwiches into perfect triangles. There's something else in the folder, David said gently. Something I think you should see before you make your decision. Despite every instinct screaming at her to run, Talia reached for the last photograph in the stack. It showed her as a toddler, maybe 18 months old, sitting in a high chair. But she wasn't alone. Her mother was there too, feeding her, both of them laughing at some private joke. Miranda looked tired but genuinely happy, completely focused on her child. That was taken 3 days before she called Daniel Mercer, David said softly. 3 days before she decided to throw it all away for a man she barely knew. Talia stared at the photograph, at evidence of love she'd never been allowed to remember. Her mother hadn't been the cold, distant figure from David's carefully curated stories. She'd been a young woman, flawed but trying, who'd loved her daughter enough to die for her. She wasn't calling Daniel to run away with him, Talia said, the truth crystallizing with painful clarity. She was calling to warn someone about you. David's expression didn't change. Does it matter what she intended? What matters is what I prevented. Outside, car doors slammed. Ray's voice, shouting orders to other officers. The sound of men taking positions around the house. They're here, David observed calmly. Time to choose, sweetheart. Your real father or the people who want to destroy our family. Talia looked at the knife in his hand, at the photographs scattered across the table, at the man who had raised her with infinite patience and hidden monstrosity. For 40 years, she'd been living inside his story about himself. For 40 years, she'd been the unknowing audience for his performance as a loving father. But she was also, she realized, the one person in the world who knew him well enough to predict his next move. I choose you, she said quietly, moving closer to the table. I choose family. David's face lit up with genuine joy. I knew you would. I raised you to be loyal, to understand that love sometimes requires sacrifice. I understand, Talia said, reaching across the table toward him. I understand everything now. And when he relaxed, when his guard dropped for just a moment as he reached to embrace the daughter he'd spent 40 years creating, she grabbed the knife. The knife felt heavier than it should have, weighted with 40 years of lies and love twisted into something unrecognizable. Talia held it between them, her hands steady even as her world collapsed and rebuilt itself around this single moment of clarity. David looked at the blade, then at her face, and his expression shifted from surprise to something that might have been pride. There she is, he said softly. There's my daughter. I'm not your daughter. You're exactly my daughter. Look at yourself, Talia. Look what you're willing to do to protect the truth. His voice carried the same warm approval she'd heard after good report cards and successful school plays. You're willing to kill for what you believe in, just like me. The kitchen door burst open, Ray and two other officers flooding in with weapons drawn, but they stopped short when they saw the tableau. Talia holding the knife, David sitting calmly with his hands visible on the table, both of them frozen in a moment that felt suspended outside of time. Talia, put the knife down, Ray said carefully, but she couldn't move, because David was right. She was holding a weapon, ready to use it, ready to become exactly what he'd spent 40 years shaping her into. The realization was more terrifying than anything he'd done to her mother, to Linda Kozlov, to the other women whose names she'd never know. He's in my head, she whispered. Even now, knowing what he is, he's still in my head. That's what love is, sweetheart, David said gently. We become part of each other. We shape each other. Every conversation we've had, every bedtime story I read, every time I dried your tears, that's all still here. He tapped his chest. And it always will be. The knife trembled in her hand. She could see it so clearly. One quick movement and 40 years of lies would be over. Justice for her mother, for Linda, for all the others. The kind of ending her podcast listeners would understand, clean and final and satisfying. But she could also see Ray watching her with growing alarm, see the other officers calculating angles and distances, see herself becoming the final victim of David's 40-year masterpiece. The loving daughter who killed her father, who proved that blood and violence were the only truth that mattered. No, she said finally, and set the knife down on the table. David's face showed genuine disappointment. Talia, no, she said again louder. I'm not going to be the end of your story. I'm not going to give you that satisfaction. Ray moved quickly, cuffing David while he sat motionless at the table. But even with metal around his wrists, even with officers reading him his rights, David's attention remained fixed on Talia. This isn't over, sweetheart. Can't be over. I'm part of you now, permanently. Every relationship you try to have, every person you try to trust, you'll see me in them. You'll wonder what they're hiding, what lies they're telling. You'll push everyone away because you'll never be sure who's real and who's performing. The words hit like physical blows because they contained the terrible weight of truth. How could she ever trust her own perceptions again? How could she believe anyone's love was genuine when the most convincing love of her life had been entirely manufactured? Maybe, she said, but that's my choice to make, not yours. As they led David away, he turned back one final time. I do love you, Talia. That was never a lie. And that was the worst part. She believed him. Despite everything, despite the bodies and the decades of manipulation, she believed that some twisted version of love had motivated everything he'd done. The man who'd raised her was both a loving father and a serial killer, both protector and predator, both real and performance. The house felt different after they left, hollow and strange, like a movie set after the cameras stopped rolling. Talia walked through rooms that had once felt like home, touching furniture and photographs that now seemed like props in an elaborate production designed for an audience of one. Ray found her in her childhood bedroom, sitting on the single bed where David had read her stories every night for years. The media's going to want statements, he said gently. And there'll be trials, depositions, years of legal proceedings. Are you ready for that? Are you asking if I'm ready to have my entire life dissected in public? To become famous as the daughter of a serial killer? Talia managed a bitter smile. I've been preparing for this my whole career, actually. I just didn't know it. What will you do after all this? She looked around the room, at the bookshelf full of stories David had chosen for her, at the desk where she'd done homework under his patient guidance, at the window he'd installed new locks on when she was 12 because he wanted her to feel safe. I think I need to figure out who I am when I'm not his daughter, she said finally. I think I need to remember my mother. 6 months later, Talia stood at the edge of Morning Lake, the same water that had given its name to the place where her story truly began. She'd spent the intervening time in therapy, in depositions, in the strange liminal space between her old life and whatever came next. The trials were still ongoing. David had confessed to 12 murders spanning 4 decades, though investigators suspected there were more. But today wasn't about him. Today was about the small memorial she'd had placed near the shoreline. A simple stone marker with 3 words. Miranda Wallace remembered. She'd learned things about her mother in recent months. From her sister Sarah, from old friends who came forward after the story broke, from journals and letters that David hadn't been able to destroy. Miranda had been young, yes, and perhaps naive, but she'd also been funny and artistic and fiercely protective of her daughter. She'd died trying to save other women from the man she'd accidentally loved. Talia pulled out her phone and opened the voice memo app, the same one she'd used to record countless podcast episodes over the years. This is Talia Granger, she said to the water, to the sky, to anyone who might be listening. And this is the story I've never told before. The story of a woman named Miranda Wallace, who loved her daughter enough to die for strangers, who chose truth over safety, courage over comfort. She paused, watching ripples spread across the lake's surface. I don't know who I am yet, without his voice in my head telling me who to be, but I know who I want to become. Someone who tells true stories, someone who remembers the forgotten, someone who chooses love over fear, even when love is complicated and imperfect and dangerous. The sun was setting behind the trees, painting the water gold and red. Somewhere in the distance, a loon called out. Not a warning this time, but a greeting. Talia Granger walked away from the lake, away from the past, toward whatever came next. Behind her, the memorial stone caught the last light of day, holding her mother's name against the gathering darkness, refusing to let it be forgotten again. In her pocket, her phone buzzed with a message from her new therapist. How did today go? She typed back. I remembered something true, and for the first time in 40 years that felt like enough.